Amir Ali sir for your close observation on this topic. We will take your points, we will consider your points. At the same time, we have to think about future course very closely. So I would like to invite Raghunandan to speak. This from Delhi Science Program, he was former JNUSU President.
Good afternoon to you all. I'm glad to be here with you today. If I remember right, I was here on campus a few months ago when the primaries were just about beginning. And if I remember right, at that time, there were several people wondering what I was doing here, speaking on this platform, and what my background is. So I thought I'd quickly shed a little light on that before I get down to speaking, just so that you know where I'm coming from. I work broadly as part of the anti-globalization movement, both in India and worldwide, having been a part of the World Social Forum process from the beginning. I am also worked as part of the climate justice movement, and therefore am involved in dealing with the policy platforms of all major governments and countries of the world, and therefore I'm interested in all this. And of course I am associated in India with the People's Science Movement, which is a core part of these two movements, both nationally and internationally, that I'm talking about. So that's just to give you a quick idea of where I'm coming from, etc. Now to the US elections. Let me first begin by saying that I myself, personally, if you ask me, my predictions went as wrong as those of many other predictors, whether they were media commentators or political scientists or others. And yet, in some ways, I'm not too surprised for two reasons. One is that given the system of elections in the US, the margins have not been all that substantial. If you look at what Vijay was talking about as the swing states, your Wisconsins, your Michigans, Florida, except for Ohio, which had an 8% gap between the two, the others really had gaps of 1% or under. It was the so-called blue wall which Hillary Clinton was expecting as the rock which would protect her from the Trump onslaught, which gave way before the Trump onslaught, and largely because there were crucial demographics in these states which did not turn out in Clinton's favor as much as they had done for Obama, and that 2% or 3% gap made all the difference. And these key demographics, if I can quickly point to them, were the white working class vote, the Hispanic or Latino vote, and the black vote. Each of which, in terms of the votes for the Democratic contender, were about 5 to 6% less than they were for Obama. And clearly, when you have margins of 1 to 2%, those 5 to 6% make a big difference. But more than the electoral calculus, I think I would take away from this something else. When I was here last to speak to you at the time when the primaries were beginning, I spent some time talking about in the political process in the United States, as well as in several other countries in the West, in Europe, I spoke about the collapse of the political center. And that we have seen during these elections as well, and in the run-up to them, the conventional political wisdom in the US was that a candidate, in order to be able to win, whether he was a Republican or a Democrat candidate, should veer towards the center. And the closer to the center the candidate was, the greater were his or her winnability chances. And many people, for example, still speak of Bill Clinton's shift to the center, away from what was expected to be a more left of center platform of his, and blame that for the rightward shift of American politics, which then led to the neocons and to George W., to Bush 43, and so on. But more than that, we have seen Clinton, this time Hillary Clinton, was stuck bang in the center. Because Bernie Sanders took the platform on the left of her. Trump, despite his hazy ideological position, was clearly on the right. And Hillary Clinton had no option. She was not talking about veering to the left or to the center. She was in the center and she had nowhere else to go. Being in the center, she had no message. And this was, I think, clear through the election. She had no message at all. And finally, she fell back into what Vijay was talking about, anti-incumbency against her. The anti-incumbency against her was, in the absence of any platform, she ended up just being a defender of the Obama legacy. And therefore, all the anti-incumbency, as you call it, really fell on her shoulders and left her very little to defend. But I think those are the electoral specifics. I would like to look a little beyond this at if you follow the news commentary and the media commentary on the election process, you would constantly hear this talk about the anger in the American people, the anger against the establishment. And I often wonder, and I still wonder, I'm still to decode this anger. Who was the anger against and what was the anger about? I think two definite understandings we do get, not only from what happened in the United States this time, but also from what we see happening in other Western capitalist countries, and that is a disillusionment with globalization as we know it. And disillusionment by whom? Disillusionment particularly among the working class. There is, and we saw this, I'm glad that we spoke of the Brexit comparison. Precisely what we saw in the United Kingdom also was, there was a substantial section of the working class, despite the fact that the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn was also part of the Remain platform. A very substantial section of the working people voted to exit because they did not see any benefit to them coming from globalization. In fact, they felt threatened by a loss of jobs, by jobs in the UK going to immigrants from Europe, and what a perceived loss of national character due to heavier immigration encouraged by this process of globalization and greater integration in Europe. We'll see very similar trends in the US election this time with very similar reasoning. Reasoning was American jobs are being taken away to China, American jobs are being lost because Mexicans are coming over to the United States and immigration is increasing. And who are the people who are most affected or grieved by this? Big chunk of the working class, which has been part of the blue wall for at least the last 30 years of the election cycles in the US, which today have dissipated. If you look closer at the numbers, you will see that white, working class, non-college educated vote, it's not as if the bulk of it has gone to Trump, but a split of 48-52 has gone to Trump. But this is very different from the 70-30 split that used to take place earlier. And that's a huge chunk of vote which is gone. Now, the question arises, this disenchantment with globalization among the working population in particular, part of it is true, that there is a loss of jobs, there is a shift of manufacturing. The Rust Belt problem, for example, actually starts even before the last 20 years. It dates back to technological shifts that have taken place globally. It dates back to the shift of the steel industry to higher efficiency areas in China and Korea and earlier in Japan. It starts with the shift of the automobile industry from Detroit away from this, predating much of what we know as the modern process of globalization. Yet, these processes were identified with the process of globalization, and which has hurt a certain section of people. Now, this phenomenon is there in the United States today as favored Donald Trump. You also see the same trend in the United Kingdom, which favored the Brexit vote. Today, predictions are, if and when elections are held in France, the socialist left is not going to be able to hold its own. Vote is going to shift to the far right, to Le Pen and that group, as well as now to a resurgent Sarkozy who is making an appearance. You see similar trends in Hungary, in Poland, and in many other countries in Europe. This shift to the right, largely spurred by disillusionment with the process of globalization. I think we need to understand this a little bit more. I won't speak too much about this, but leave you with this thought, and that is, if you have got disenchantment with globalization in the heart of advanced capitalism in Western Europe and the United States, what does that mean? And what will it mean for a Trump presidency? Is he going to be able to lead the United States away from globalization? Is that what we foresee? I don't think so. I think what we are going to witness is, in the United States now, as well as in Europe as we know it, a tension between the forces of global capital wanting to hold on to capitalist globalization, to trade agreements as they know it, the tension between that and the tension between isolationist forces which want to step back from globalization into a more protectionist environment. I think this tension we will see unfolding with a lot of what it entails. In connection with this, I also want to add that this is, after all, we are talking about an electoral process. And not everything in electoral processes are decided by the logic of arguments advanced on either side. In fact, much of this so-called anger that is spoken about is not only an anger against the Washington establishment, or in the case of the United Kingdom, a protest against the bulk of parliamentarians who are for Remain but an abstract anger against an intellectual, policy-oriented elite among the political class, among the intellectual class, among academics, and so on. This is equally a protest against them. Inchoate, unarticulated, not very well articulated, backed more by emotion than by logic, but that is there. And this is not a trend confined to the United States. We've seen the same kinds of trends in Europe, and I dare say we see that trend right here at home. I think this is something for us to think about. We are, after all, in a democratic polity, and we are engaged in a continuous struggle against ideas of a certain kind, against movements of a certain kind. I think it's a cause for introspection as to how opposition to such forces requires to be cast. I think an over-reliance on pure logic and argument, however sound they appear to us, may not be the only way to go. I think because we've seen in case after case, in country after country, you go on arguing, all the arguments that were leveled against Donald Trump, all the arguments that were leveled against Brexit, ultimately didn't cut any ice. There was a chunk of people who believed something, who perceived something. And as they say, perception matters. I think we need to understand, Vijay started off by saying she will not address the fourth P of psychology, but I think it's important for us to understand that fourth P a little better as to what is it that motivates electorates. We can see here in our country arguments in defense of secularism, arguments in defense of pluralism, arguments in defense of liberalism among a certain section of the population, but no ice whatsoever, because they've already convinced themselves that all these things don't matter. What we believe is right. And I think we need to figure out a way of how to get around this in order to be able to break it. The last point I want to make is, with the collapse of the political center and the inability or difficulties faced by the framing of arguments against, in this, what I call the battle of perception, which is what it is. Jobs in the US are not being lost to Mexicans. Jobs in the United States, even if they are going away to China, the counterpart is the cheaper consumer goods that are coming into the United States, which the same people are buying. And these are processes of globalization not imposed on the United States by any outsiders, but steered and led by the United States itself. It's also an illusion in the United Kingdom to think that it's these flood of Poles and Bulgarians who are coming from Europe which have taken away British jobs. These were jobs which the British people did not want to do or were not doing, which is why there was labor being imported from other countries. But perception is these jobs are going. They are being taken away. And to blame in Europe and in the United States the immigrant, the foreigner, that's the Chinese, and in India, since you can't blame those, you blame somebody inside the country. You blame the minorities, and it's the same in Trump, it's the same in the United States. This is something we need to think about as to how the dynamics unfolds. As I said, the last thing I want to speak about, just for 2 minutes. With the collapse of the center and the battle of perception, the collapse of the center and the battle for perception, the counter to globalization, the counter argument to globalization is going to come from where? I think, particularly since I'm addressing an audience in JNU, I'd just like to focus our attention on this for us to think about. Why is it that we have not yet been able to see a credible argument converting into a credible political force coming from the left? We've seen some efforts in Greece, Syriza, in Podemos, in Spain, but we are yet to see a credible left force and a credible left argument against globalization with the backing of a credible, constructed alternative in governance. I think the left in this country, and of course the left in other countries, will have to do some more serious thinking in terms of alternatives to globalization and a left argument to be put forward for that. Because in the absence of that, you are going to have, with the collapse of the center, only the perception arguments of the Trumps and the Le Pens, and if I dare say, the Modis.
Thank you.